They can see everything about you. They can see everything about what your device is doing, and they can do whatever they want with your device. You, on the other hand, owned the device. Well, rather, you paid for the device. But increasingly, these corporations own it. Increasingly, these governments own it. And increasingly, we are living in a world where we do all the work, right? We pay all the taxes. We pay all the costs. But we own less and less. And nobody understands this better than the youngest generation. That happens as a result of a single problem. And that problem is an inequality of available information. We have a problem, guys. This should be a much more simple process. It should be obvious. And the fact that it's not, and the fact that we read story after story, year after year, saying all your data has been breached here, this company's spying on you here, this company's manipulating your purchases or your search results, or they're hiding these things from your timeline, or they're influencing you or manipulating you in all of these different ways. They built a satellite listening site, right? We call these foreign satellite collection. Where out in the desert somewhere, they built a big parabolic collector, and it's just listening to satellite emissions, right? But these satellite emissions, these satellite links, were owned by militaries. They were exclusive to governments, right? It wasn't affecting everybody broadly. All surveillance was targeted because it had to be. What changed with technology is that surveillance could now become indiscriminate. It could become dragnet. It could become bulk collection, which should become one of the dirtiest phrases in the language if we have any kind of decency. But we were intentionally, this was intentionally concealed from us, right? The government did it. They used classification. Companies did it. They intentionally didn't talk about it. They denied these things were going. They said, you agreed to this, and you didn't agree to nothing like this. I'm sorry, right? They go, we put that terms of service page up, and you clicked that. You clicked a button that said, I agree, because you were trying to open an account so you could talk to your friends. You were trying to get driving directions. You were trying to get an email account. You weren't trying to agree to some 600-page legal form that even if you read, you wouldn't understand. And it doesn't matter even if you did understand, because one of the very first paragraphs in it said, this agreement can be changed at any time unilaterally without your consent by the company, right? They have built a legal paradigm that presumes records collected about us do not belong to us. This is sort of one of the core principles on which mass surveillance from the government's perspective in the United States is legal. And you have to understand that all the stuff we talked about today, the government says everything they do is legal, right? And they go, so it's fine. Our perspective as a public should be, well, that's actually the problem, because this isn't okay. The scandal isn't how they're breaking the law. The scandal is that they don't have to break the law. Is that whenever you're carrying a phone, whenever the phone is turned on, there's a record of your presence at that place that is being made and created by companies. It does not need to be kept forever, and in fact, there's no good argument for it to be kept forever, but these companies see that as valuable information, right? This is the whole big data problem that we're running into, and all this information that used to be ephemeral, right? Where were you when you were 8 years old, you know? Where'd you go after you had a bad breakup? You know, who'd you spend the night with? Who'd you call after? All this information used to be ephemeral, meaning it disappeared, right? Like the morning dew, it would be gone. No one would remember it. But now these things are stored. Now these things are saved. It doesn't matter whether you're doing anything wrong. It doesn't matter whether you're the most ordinary person on earth, because that's how bulk collection, which is the government's euphemism for mass surveillance, works. They simply collect it all in advance in hopes that one day it will become useful. Your primary threats are these bulk collection programs. Your primary threat is the fact that your phone is constantly squawking to these cell phone towers. It's doing all of these things because we leave our phones in a state that is constantly on. You're constantly connected, right? Airplane mode doesn't even turn off Wi-Fi really anymore. It just turns off the cellular modem. Nobody has a privacy right for anything that's held by a company. And so long as they do that, companies are going to be extraordinarily powerful and they're going to be extraordinarily abusive. And this is something that people don't get. They go, oh, well, it's data collection, right? They're exploiting data. This is data about human lives. It is data about people. These records are about you. It's not data that's being exploited. It's people that are being exploited. It's not data that's being manipulated. It's you that's being manipulated. And this is something that I think a lot of people are beginning to understand. Now, the problem is the companies and the governments are still pretending they don't understand or disagreeing with this. As they sell these, as they trade these, as they make their businesses on the backs of these records, what they are selling is not information. What they are selling is us. They're selling our future. They're selling our past. They are selling our history, our identity, and ultimately, they are stealing our power. Once your phone is hacked, what is in their hands is not simply your device, it is your future. It's important also to remember how, but we see how these same technologies are being applied to create what they call the social credit system.
Everywhere she goes, Oh Young Hallyu is followed. What she buys, how she behaves, is tracked and scored to show how responsible and trustworthy she is.
If any of these family photos, if any of your activities online, if your purchases, if your associations, if your friends are in any way different from what the government or the powers that be of the moment would like them to be, you're no longer able to purchase train tickets. You're no longer able to board an airplane. You may not be able to get a passport. You may not be eligible for a job. You might not be able to work for the government. All of these things are increasingly being created and programmed and decided by algorithms. And those algorithms are fueled by precisely the innocent data that our devices are creating all of the time, constantly, invisibly, quietly, right now. Our devices are casting all of these records. You were at Starbucks at this time. You went to the hospital afterwards. You spent a long time at the hospital. After you left the hospital, you made a phone call. You made a phone call to your mother. You talked to her until the middle of the night. The hospital was an oncology clinic. Even if you can't see the content of these communications, the activity records, what the government calls metadata, which they argue they do not need a warrant to collect, tells the whole story. And these activity records are being created and shared and collected and intercepted constantly by companies and governments. And ultimately it means as they sell these, as they trade these, as they make their businesses on the backs of these records, what they are selling is not information. What they are selling is us. They're selling our future. They're selling our past. They are selling our history, our identity, and ultimately, they are stealing our power and making our stories work for them. I try not to make that easy for them. If I get a smartphone and I need to use a phone, I actually open it up before I use it. I perform a kind of surgery on it to physically desolder or sort of melt the metal connections that hold the microphone on the phone. And I physically take this off. I remove the camera for the phone, and then I close it back up, I seal it up. And then if I need to make a phone call, I will attach an external microphone on it. And this is just so if the phone is sitting there and I'm not making a call, it cannot hear me. Now this is extreme. Most people do not need this. But for me, it's about being able to trust our technology. My phone could still be hacked. My laptop could still be hacked. And just as I told you before, the same principles apply to me. If it is hacked, they can do anything to the device that I can do. So my trust in technology is limited. But just because that's how it is today doesn't mean that's how it has to be. And a large majority of my work with the Freedom of the Press Foundation, where I serve as president of the board, is dedicated to trying to make technology more secure, to try to create programs and protocols by which we can make the communications of sources and journalists more confidential. Because if we lose the confidentiality between sources and journalists, we lose access to those essential facts that let us understand what's happening in the world. And unfortunately, under this White House, just like under the prior White House, we see the sources of very important stories that have advanced the public interest facing retaliation from a very angry government. Well, for the vast majority of my career, I was what was called a systems engineer or a systems administrator. An administrator sort of maintains and expands a system that they have inherited, and a systems engineer sort of develops new projects, new capabilities for these systems roles. What this means, in short, was that all of the systems that the NSA and the CIA that I was put in charge of, I had total access to. And this is just what happens with a systems administrator. When you think about a computer system, who gives someone else access? Well, someone has to be the original authority that has access to everything. That was me. And so I would say the computer guy knows everything. That's not a boast. That's simply the way these systems are designed. That's the way they're structured. And this is very much a vulnerability, because it means that you have to trust this administrator will work to the good of the users. But what happens when the people using that network, the people constructing that network, are going against the benefit of the broader society? And this put me in a very interesting kind of conflicted position. I could do what the NSA wanted me to do, or I could do what the Constitution of the United States, the public of the United States, needed me to do, which was report that my agency had broken the law.
Do you regard yourself as a journalist these days?
I'm not. I have tremendous respect for journalists, but I try to keep a distance, particularly in this moment where so much of journalism is coming under attack. Because the government has a tremendous incentive to discredit me, to make people distrust me. And so if I hold myself out, if I start reporting stories, if I start talking to sources, if I try to start advancing what the public knows on a personal level, my reputation could sort of poison the well. Instead, I keep a distinction. What I do is I try to aid the work of journalism, but I'm not myself a journalist. So in the wake of the revelations of mass surveillance in 2013, this was suddenly the world's biggest story. In every country, they were talking about the same thing. And unfortunately, that meant that everyone who was connected to me in some way, they were also talking about, because they were trying to say who I was, where I came from. And this unfortunately meant that Lindsay, my lifelong partner, was intensely investigated, both by the FBI in the United States. She didn't know what I was doing. I could not tell her what I was doing, because if I had, they would have said she was an accessory to the crime. They would have said she was part of a criminal conspiracy, so long as she didn't immediately pick up the phone and say, help, help, someone's talking to a journalist. And so this meant that I couldn't tell her. She learned about what was going to happen the same way everybody else did, or rather what is happening, the same way everybody else did. She saw me on TV, which probably makes me the worst boyfriend in the history of the United States. But she stuck by me, and we are reunited and together today. And I will never be able to repay her for the faith that she's shown.